Welcome. My name is Dr. Laurie Bruce. I'm a clinical psychologist and mindfulness coach, and this is From Both Sides of the Couch. In this podcast, I will be sharing with you ideas, strategies, and nuggets of wisdom from my 25 years of experience as a therapist and as a client in my own therapy. I am passionate about helping the helpers, those of us who are caregivers, either by profession or in our personal lives. Join me as we explore topics such as building resilience, self-care and self-acceptance, reducing stress, anxiety, and guilt, and how to live the happiest and most fulfilling life possible. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to From Both Sides of the Couch. This is Dr. Laurie Bruce, and I'm so honored that you are joining me today for my second episode. Today, we're going to talk about how to accept the unacceptable. This topic is relevant to almost everyone at some point or another in our lives. But I thought it might be a good topic to talk about right now because I have been seeing a lot of patients recently who are really struggling with coming to terms with the reality of our most recent election in the U.S. I also work with many patients who are struggling to accept an illness, either in themselves or in someone that they care about, whether it's a physical illness like terminal cancer or a mental illness like bipolar disorder or PTSD. Everyone at some point in their lives will experience something that feels absolutely devastating and unacceptable. When things like this happen at first, it feels like it's just impossible to wrap your mind around it. How do I make sense of this? How is this even possible? Today, I'm going to share with you some ways to think about your pain that may help to ease it just a little bit. There's obviously nothing that I or anyone can do or say to make a situation like this good, but there are some key mindset shifts that we can try to practice during these difficult times, which can make a key difference in how we think about our situation and how we feel. Let's start with reviewing the concept of stages of grief. Most of us know this concept by now, or you've heard of this concept. You may not know that it was first introduced in the 1960s by a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And Dr. Kubler-Ross identified 5 stages of grief, which include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Additional researchers have suggested that there could be additional stages, including guilt and reconstruction and working through. But let's talk about all of these stages. Let's start with the first stage, which is called shock and denial. In this early stage, you have just learned some horrible news. Maybe you have just received a diagnosis or just heard some terrible news. Maybe your spouse tells you that they want a divorce. In this first phase, you're likely to find that your mind goes blank and you find it very hard to process the information that is coming to you. Physiologically, a lot of things are happening very quickly in your body and outside of your awareness. When we hear devastating news, our brain immediately gets to work in order to protect you. It rapidly starts sending out hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which cause your heart rate to increase, your blood pressure and your breathing all to increase. Put simply, your brain cannot perceive the difference between a dangerous bear and sudden devastating news. It sees both of these things as threats, which require a fight or flight response. Although, of course, you cannot fight or flee from devastating news, your brain really doesn't get that. With all of these physiological changes occurring, less blood and oxygen are going to your brain, making your brain unable to function very well. This is what causes that foggy, spacey, oh my gosh, I can't believe it kind of feeling. And this foggy feeling can last for quite some time, for even days or weeks after the initial event. You might find yourself saying things like, I just can't believe this is happening. I never imagined in a million years this would happen to me, or just that this would happen at all. And so, in those first early weeks of receiving devastating news, you might find it very difficult to focus or concentrate or remember things. You might even find some word finding difficulties and just difficulty thinking altogether. Some people settle into this stage for quite a while and start to use denial as a coping strategy. And this is really less about the physiological impact of fight or flight and more about our way of coping with really painful emotions. Some of us are more prone to not wanting to think about things or feel painful emotions. So we push these thoughts and feelings away in order to help us stay in this denial stage. And really, this is a helpful coping mechanism at first. To gradually, slowly come to process and accept what is happening is more helpful. So denial is really helpful at first, but ultimately it does not help us to move through the remaining stages of grief. After some period of time, it's difficult to stay in the shock and the denial stage. Maybe the reality of your situation is forced upon you. And that's often when another stage of grief happens, which is called the anger stage. During the anger stage, we may feel angry at the person who has hurt, left, or betrayed us. We might even feel angry at a person who has died. This is normal. We might feel angry at God or the universe for allowing bad things to happen to good people. And some of us can feel stuck at this stage. Feeling angry actually helps us to avoid the pain of the sadness underneath. Another stage is what we call bargaining. In this stage, we tend to ruminate and ask all of these why questions. It's also a stage where we make to ourselves a lot of if only statements. We tend to create these imaginary scenarios in our minds, like if only I had seen it sooner, or if only I had known this would happen, I would have done so much differently. We might even try to make deals or promises with our higher power in order to make the situation change. Eventually, the stage of depression or sadness begins. This is the sadness underneath all of that denial and anger and bargaining, and it really is the most painful part of the process. The loss that you're experiencing may feel so profound, at times it might feel unbearable. And during this process, people will often lose their appetite, have disrupted sleep, and really feel like it's difficult to experience any joy. The future may feel bleak and hopeless. Although initially researchers believed that people who grieve go through these stages in a sequential format, we all know that nothing in life is really that easy. Most people actually vacillate back and forth between all of these stages. At times, you may feel a profound sense of sadness, but then have moments where the anger returns and the ruminative stage of why and if only questions can return. We can just go back and forth between all of these stages for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. Eventually, for most individuals, there comes a point where a person starts moving towards a state of acceptance. It's important to recognize what acceptance is and what it is not. Acceptance means that you are no longer fighting your reality. You have recognized that the situation is the truth, and you're going to have to find a way to live with it. Acceptance means that you are no longer ruminating about the past, and you're just starting to embrace what your new future could look like. Acceptance does not mean that you are glad it happened or that you're trying to make yourself believe that it was all for the best. It's not about liking the situation. It really just means that you're no longer putting in that emotional energy that goes towards feeling angry and sad and hopeless about it. You're starting to feel ready to live with your new circumstances as best as you can. This process can take months, can even take years, depending on what you have experienced. There's no timeline on grief. Unfortunately, no one can predict how long it will take to get to the acceptance stage. What we do know is that the more you are able to allow yourself space and permission to feel everything that you need to feel, you will heal. And of course, I know I'm biased, but I really do believe that therapy can be profoundly helpful for this process. Oftentimes, friends mean to be helpful, but it's very, very difficult for a friend to sit with you and be present with your pain for such a long time, because oftentimes friends want to just move into problem-solving mode or putting a positive spin on the situation. And really, truly, that is not what you need. Therapists are trained to sit with grief and to not feel that impulse to fix it for you. This is hard, even for therapists. Even being trained in this, it's still really difficult. However, we know that it's so necessary for the healing process. And on a personal level, my therapist has been absolutely invaluable for me in this past year. And I truly don't know how I would have gotten through this without his support and patience. What else helps us to accept the unacceptable? It is very important to recognize the concept of primary and secondary emotions. The primary emotion is how we feel about a situation, but the secondary emotion is how we are feeling about having that feeling. For example, it is completely normal to feel angry at a loved one who died suddenly or unexpectedly. You may feel angry at them for leaving you with no warning. However, you might then feel guilty or ashamed that you're feeling angry with them. Your logical side knows that it was not the other person's fault, so you really shouldn't blame them. Anger is that primary emotion, but the guilt and the shame about feeling anger are the secondary emotions. We know that secondary emotions have the effect of worsening the intensity and duration of emotional distress. So it's very important to notice if you're having secondary emotions, please try to just make sure to give yourself permission to fully feel that primary emotion. Let yourself feel angry at that person, even though you know it's not logical or fair. Just let yourself feel it in order to work it through. It is only by feeling and experiencing our emotions that they will lose their intensity over time. Lastly, the concept of radical acceptance is what I most often use to help me accept the unacceptable. Radical means fully, completely, totally, and without exception. And acceptance means acknowledging the reality of the situation. So put them together, radical acceptance means that I fully and completely acknowledge that this is the reality of my situation. I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it, but I'm going to choose to give up fighting the situation or the need for the situation to be different. We use radical acceptance in situations that are not changeable. So, of course, for the things that we can change, we want to problem solve, we want to come up with ways and solutions to make our situation better. But for the things that we cannot change, and life gives us tons and tons of things that we cannot change, we can practice radical acceptance. I first learned about radical acceptance from Dr. Marsha Linehan when I was learning the type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, that is my primary training. Later, I read a wonderful book by Tara Brach with that same title, Radical Acceptance. It is a wonderful resource for learning about these concepts. Tara Brach talks about radical acceptance as well as radical compassion. And both of these concepts are very important for having more peace in our lives. When we are able to practice radical acceptance, it does not mean that we are no longer feeling pain. Pain is an inevitable part of life. Pain is unavoidable and really shouldn't be avoided because pain is how we learn and grow. But there is a fundamental difference between pain and suffering. Pain is natural, it's normal, it's healthy. Suffering is optional. Suffering is when we are in pain and we believe we cannot tolerate that pain. We invest emotional energy into trying to make the unchangeable different than it is. That is suffering. When we can truly just accept that our reality is as it is, then we are no longer suffering. There is just pain. And in time, all pain heals. Remember that accepting the unacceptable is not an easy, linear task. It is messy, it's painful, it's complicated. We go back and forth and in circles and upside down and all around. We have to understand that this is a messy process. And when we can do that, it allows us to have more compassion for ourselves when it feels like we're going backwards or it feels like it's taking longer than it should. Remember, there is no timeline on grief. If someone in your life tells you or suggests to you that you should be over it by now, just ignore them. They clearly have not yet suffered through a very painful loss, or they have forgotten how difficult it is. Don't compare your journey to anyone else's. It takes as long as it takes. That's a sentence that I have repeated to myself frequently in the last year. It takes as long as it takes. I sincerely hope that some of this has been helpful for you today. If you are currently in a painful situation, I would love to hear from you. What has helped you to overcome and survive something that initially felt unacceptable or unsurvivable? What mindset shifts or strategies do you use to help you cope? You can message me at drlaurie@drlauriebruce.com or visit me at my website, drlauriebruce.com, for more information. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you in the next episode.